The Orioles have hired their manager in Craig Albernaz. The next question is, who is and who isn't going to be on his coaching staff? Well, we got some of those answers earlier this week, and we'll get to them coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, October 30th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to run through some Orioles coaching news from the week. We know Craig Albernaz is the new manager, but we know that two of the Orioles hitting coaches are gone, and a lot of other guys on this staff are up in the air heading into 2026. And we'll discuss all of that news coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Just download the FanDuel app today. So for the Orioles, they made the big hire on Sunday night, announced it on Monday. Craig Albernaz coming over from the Cleveland Guardians, where he was their bench coach / associate manager for the past 2 years under Stephen Vogt with back-to-back AL Central championships. He is going to be the new head man for the Orioles. And I talked about this a little bit on Monday night's live episode. If you have not checked that one out yet, make sure to go back and check out that episode. Did the full breakdown on Albernaz, his baseball background, and what the hire means for the Orioles. But I chatted a little bit at the end of the episode about, okay, what is next for the Orioles when it comes to this coaching staff? Because whenever you bring in a new manager, rarely will you input a new manager and keep the entirety of the coaching staff around him exactly the same. Usually that manager wants to bring in, one or two or more of his own guys to add to the staff. Maybe you want to make some other changes, because generally when you have a new manager, it means your team maybe didn't do so hot this season, which is what happened to the Orioles with 75 wins. So maybe making other changes elsewhere, kind of just outside of who that manager wants. Now for Albernaz, he is a first-time big league manager. I would think he doesn't get the authority, and he would know this when taking the job, to, bring in an entirely new staff that's just his people. He might get one or two spots that are for him. Remember, Brandon Hyde got one spot. He got to bring in Tim Cousins. Albernaz will probably get one or two, and then we'll work with Mike Elias in the front office about the decisions on all of the other staffers. But we got some reports from Andy Kuska of the Baltimore Banner this week. And the biggest one is that Andy reported on Tuesday that both Orioles assistant hitting coaches, Sherman Johnson and Tommy Joseph, will not be back with the team next season. Let's start with Sherman Johnson, who actually, you can look at this one much more of like, I don't think he was really fired from this job, because Johnson just left the organization to take another job. He is becoming the minor league hitting coordinator for the Chicago White Sox. He will be reunited with Ryan Fuller, who was the Orioles co-hitting coach from 2022 to 2024 for 3 seasons. Before that was a big-time hitting mind in the Orioles minor league system. Fuller left after last season to become the White Sox director of hitting. He now hires Sherman Johnson underneath of him. Of course, him and Johnson worked together for a year and change in the Orioles system. Now, Johnson, a former minor league player, he did debut briefly with the Angels, got to play in the big leagues for a little bit in 2018. Orioles hired him in 2023 to be the hitting coach in Double-A Bowie. He was then promoted to be Orioles upper-level minor league hitting coordinator for the 2024 season. And then for this year, Johnson's 3rd year in the organization, they kept his minor league hitting coordinator title, but added assistant MLB hitting coach to his title as well. I don't know exactly what Johnson was up to, but I believe that means he was not with the big league team for all 162 games. I think that means there was a little bit of time where he was with the minor leagues rather than with the major league team. I think so majority of the time he was with the Orioles, but not the entirety of the time. It was just kind of part of that greater hitting staff. He found another role. Does that mean the Orioles weren't going to let him go after this season? No, it doesn't, but don't think of this as a firing. I mean, pretty shortly here, he took another job with someone who knows him, who wanted him on that staff, and Ryan Fuller, and so he leaves. Now, for Tommy Joseph, according to Andy Kuska's reporting, it was, quote, Joseph is not returning to the Orioles next year, And at this point, recording on Wednesday evening, there's no next job lined up for Tommy Joseph. That feels to me a little bit more of a parting ways, a moving on, a firing, whatever you want to call it, than it was with Sherman Johnson. It makes sense because Joseph had much less just equity built up in the Orioles system. Johnson was with the O's for 3 years. Tommy Joseph was not. He was hired before this season. He had played for the Phillies and a couple of other teams, then was hired as a minor league hitting coach for the Mets in 2021, spent 2 years in that role. Then the Giants hired him to be a minor league hitting coach in 2023. And then in 2024, he got his first big league job. The Mariners hired him as their assistant hitting coach for last season. And then the Orioles hired him away from Seattle to be an assistant MLB hitting coach for this season. It seems like he was just kind of let go from that role. Now, the Orioles, we know their struggles, right? They were a top 10 offense in Major League Baseball each of the last 2 years, which propelled them to the postseason both of those years. But they did struggle down the stretch in 2024, and there were some changes. They had co-hitting coaches in Ryan Fuller and Matt Borg-Schulte, who had held those roles for 3 straight years, 2022 to 24. Fuller had been in the Orioles system. Borg-Schulte was hired out of the Twins system. But both coaches left after last year. Now, neither were fired. Both of them, kind of like Sherman Johnson this year, immediately had jobs lined up that they took. Fuller left to be the director of hitting for the Chicago White Sox, and Borg-Schulte left to be the Minnesota Twins hitting coach. So both of them at least made parallel moves, if not promotions. And of course, Borg-Schulte had that connection to the Twins already. Neither was fired from their job, but there was pressure. There was disappointment with the performance of the hitters down the stretch last year. Maybe one or two of them felt the pressure was coming on. Maybe if they weren't going to get fired, they were going to be under a lot of scrutiny if they were back for 2025. So they made, business decisions and left. And we don't know if the Orioles would have let them go either way, but they were both well thought of and immediately, looked for other jobs and found other jobs like that. Now, the Orioles, they had a third member of that hitting crew. It was Cody Asche, who had been in the system as a minor league coach for a little while. Then the Orioles got him up onto the big league staff. He was the assistant hitting coach and kind of hitting strategy coordinator, whatever they called him. He had a couple of different roles on the team, but Asche was promoted to be the main hitting coach. And then they promoted Sherman Johnson under him and hired Tommy Joseph to be under him for the 2025 season. And now we have that shakeup, and it is a lot because the Orioles just really disappointed offensively. They were 20th in the league in team WRC plus. They were 24th in runs scored this season. Now, Kuska's reporting from this week is there's no word yet on hitting coach Cody Asche and what his future is. The fact that they made, these two moves got broken with Johnson and Joseph on the same day, and there was nothing around Asche, tells me he has a better chance of sticking around on this staff. I know the Orioles, this organization, really, really likes Cody Asche. They were super high on that hire. I think they brought him in 2022. He was hired as a minor league hitting coach, and he's been on the big league staff for the past 3 seasons in different roles. So he worked under Borg-Schulte and Fuller initially. He was part of the staff that led to, one of the best offenses in baseball back in 2023. The players, the front office, they all really like Cody Asche. So he would be the last guy of those 3 to go. So the question is, okay, you certainly have openings, right? Even if Asche stays, this is a modern front office and a modern dugout. It's not just going to be Cody Asche, one and only hitting staff member, and that's it. They're going to bring in some outside voices, whether that is someone Albernaz wants, whether that's someone Mike Elias wants, whether it's a combination of the two, that is yet to be seen. But at least one, and if not 2 more staffers are going to be either promoted or hired into those roles left by Joseph and Sherman Johnson. So there is a question around Asche. Now, I think it's most likely they will retain Cody Asche in that same role and do one of 2 things. Either they will hire kind of a director of hitting person who may work above Asche, will be in the big league dugout most of the time. That allows you to get, a different hitting coach in there, or hire a kind of co-hitting coach to work with Asche. Remember, the Orioles went 3 years with Borg-Schulte and Fuller as co-hitting coaches. It's something that happens around the league. As long as Asche is kind of bought into it to bring in someone else on his staff, I think that's possible as well. I guess it's also possible they could demote Asche, maybe give him back to a minor league role in the system. But I think they like him where he is, and just another new voice or another 2 new voices would be helpful. And again, whether they do either of those things, I think they would also bring in an assistant hitting coach as well, whether it be someone, like Mike Montville, who's been the AAA hitting coach for the past couple of years. Maybe he gets promoted, someone else from the system that they really like, or, an outside kind of up and coming hire. There'll be some new faces on the hitting staff in that dugout. And maybe that's going to be good for this team. A lot of very talented hitters who very much underperformed this season. And you have to say it every time because injuries certainly played a role for a lot of those guys underperforming, but injuries was not all of it for these guys like Adley Rutschman and Colton Cowser and, the Ryan Mountcastles of the world and the Tyler O'Neills of the world. And these guys who just did not perform, even when they were healthy, did not perform up to expectations this season. And a lot of that falls on the hitters themselves, and some of it does fall on the coaches who are in that dugout. We're never kind of going to know the full split of the blame, but the Orioles, for the second straight offseason, will have changes in that hitting room, and we'll see who those new faces are. And I know there is like a subset of the fans that are for some reason so peeved that the Orioles have multiple hitting coaches, or even if it's just one hitting coach like Ashe, multiple members of the staff as assistants when they had, Johnson and Joseph in those roles, or whether it was when Borg Schulte and Fuller were co-hitting coaches. Like, that's one of the bigger willful ignorance arguments I see. Like, look around the league, open your eyes beyond the Orioles. You look at the coaching staffs for pretty much all 30 MLB teams. You would be hard pressed to find more than 2 or 3 teams that have just one single hitting coach with 0 assistants, 0 hitting coordinators, anything like that, who work in the big league dugout. And if I did a run through now, I'm pretty sure it'd be a full 30 for 30, at least of what their 2025 staffs looked like, that there's at least multiple voices in that room. It's a lot of players to work with. It's a lot of work to do. There's no pregame versus in-game versus, 13 different hitters you're working with. It's too much work for one person. You're throwing BP, you're doing other things, you're working with guys one-on-one, you're working with groups. I don't understand how it could not be seen as a good thing to have multiple people helping you do those jobs, as long as they are all united on the same front and teaching the same things, and they're in connection with the rest of the dugout, the manager, the front office. The more the merrier in terms of coaches. And a lot of the best teams around baseball have shown you, especially when you look at just the Dodgers and the Blue Jays in the World Series, it's more coaches than you'll generally see on a staff, so that they can break up the work and give more one-on-one time to a lot of the players as well. I cannot understand how people see that as a negative, to just have multiple people in that room. Think about your job, wherever you work. Is it nice to have coworkers? Is it nice to be able to split up some of the work that you are able to do in your office, wherever you work? Yeah, it is. I know it's a very different type of job when you're working in professional baseball, but some of the base level requirements there and qualities are still good to have multiple people on a team to work together. And it's also not great to just have one single voice in there. It's harder to challenge that person, harder to get outside ideas into that person, harder for that person to evaluate themselves and to change and adapt. It is easier when you have more people in there. That's one of the weirder arguments I see from people. Just like, look around the game. And that's how it's going to be for the Orioles and pretty much every single team as we move forward here. And I'll be interested to see, who those new names might be that come onto the staff. But it's not just the hitting department, right? It's the entire staff that is kind of in flux right now. We know Joseph and Johnson are gone. We know that Craig Albernaz is here as the manager. We do know a couple of other things somewhat about these other staffers, but it's a lot of guys who are up in the air right now. I'm going to run through the rest of the coaching staff and give my predictions on whether they're here or they're elsewhere by the time we get to spring training in 2026. That's coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there is no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you miss the start of the game or want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. Keeps the game exciting, especially when your team is making that late push. And right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So for the Orioles, there's some staff changes coming. Craig Albernaz is the new manager. Sherman Johnson and Tommy Joseph both gone as assistant hitting coaches. What about the rest of the staff? Let's start with the further reports from Andy Kuska of the Baltimore Banner this week. He had a good story in the Banner on Tuesday, kind of running down everything he is hearing from sources. Andy reported that Tony Mansolino, who again was the Orioles interim manager starting in May when Brandon Hyde was fired, went 60-59 with this team down the stretch, had been with the Orioles since 2020 as their third base and infield coach, but was elevated to interim manager. As Mike Elias said, Mansolino was a candidate to get the full-time job, but I think I expected on this show and many expected he was not going to get it. Andy Kuska is now reporting that Mansolino is not expected to return to the coaching staff at all. I talked about this on Monday. There was a chance he could have gone back to his old third base coaching role, but it makes more sense that he's gone. I think Mansolino is a really good coach. I think he's a good addition to have in the clubhouse, in the dugout. I think he did a lot for this Orioles team, especially when he was in that third base coach and infield coach role. But it's just awkward for him to stay after not getting the full-time gig. I think it's better for both parties, both Mansolino and the Orioles, for them to go their separate ways. If he wants one, he is absolutely going to get a big league coaching job somewhere for 2026. And I think his experience this year as the interim gives him a better chance to manage in the big league someday as well. He's going to have that experience the teams are going to look for. Tony Mansolino, did a job, did it well for the Orioles. I wish him all the best moving forward if, in fact, he is going elsewhere from this organization. Now, Andy Kuska at the Banner also reported that Orioles first base coach Anthony Sanders has been given permission to speak with other teams about other jobs. And Andy Martino of SNY reported the same thing about Sanders. You might be thinking, what is Mets reporter Andy Martino reporting about Orioles first base coach Anthony Sanders? Well, the way Martino framed it earlier this week is that, remember on Monday, if you listen to that episode, I talked about Antoine Richardson, who had been the Mets first base coach for the past couple of years, and the Mets wanted him back, but the Mets and Richardson could not come to a contract agreement moving forward. And because of that, Richardson is not back with the Mets. He's basically a coaching free agent. Martino basically combined those things and said from his reporting, he said it sounded like Richardson was so interested in taking another job with another team that he basically, essentially gave the Mets such a high number that they weren't able to meet, or maybe he was never going to take any number and wanted to go elsewhere. Those combos, Martino was kind of pushing towards this, that it might mean that Richardson, who worked with Craig Albernaz for 4 years when they were both coaches on the Giants staff, maybe he wants to go there. I talked about on Monday that Richardson would be such a good addition because he's done wonders for the Mets base running and base stealing. They became the second best base stealing team in the league this year, turned Juan Soto into an awesome base stealer. Like, that could help the Orioles a ton as their first base coach. And if the O's have their eyes on Richardson, it makes sense that they would allow Anthony Sanders to interview for other jobs. Now, it's not a guarantee that Sanders leaves, but the Orioles hired Anthony Sanders back in 2020. He's been the first base coach for the O's ever since. He's more of a veteran coach. He'd been working under Brandon Hyde the entire time. When you get this turnover, he probably seemed like one of the most likely coaches to be gone at the end of the season just because of what happened midseason with Brandon Hyde. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he does take another job and leaves a vacancy there. And finally, the last piece of reporting from Andy Kuska is that everyone else on the coaching staff is kind of up in the air at this point. As I mentioned, Craig Albernaz probably gets some say, but not all the say in these coaches. And most coaches, non-managers, come in on 2-year deals, but that's not really confirmed on anyone specifically. So let's run through the rest of the staff, starting with pitching coach Drew French, who has been with the Orioles for 2 years. I think he stays. Now, if he was on a 2-year contract, that could be up, but for what he's been given, I think he's done a really good job with this pitching staff, and I think he deserves to stay. And honestly, that goes for his assistants as well. Mitch Plasmeyer and Ryan Klimek, the two other kind of members, assistant pitching coaches / bullpen coaches / pitching strategy coordinators, kind of all the roles they've had. These guys have been around for a bit in the minors and majors with the Orioles system. The O's really value them, and I wouldn't be surprised if both of them are back as well. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if the agreement with Albernaz and Elias was Elias being like, hey, on the pitching side, we want to keep our guys. On the hitting side and elsewhere, you can have a whole lot of say on what goes on with this coaching staff. And maybe that was an agreement they came to because the O's really like these pitching guys. I think all three have a real shot of coming back on this staff. Bench coach Robinson Chirinos is the one that I think could go either way. Now, Chirinos, remember, it was his first year as a big league coach at all when the Orioles hired him to be their bench coach for 2025. Most likely he has a second year on his contract, and he did play with Craig Albernaz in the minor leagues at one point, so the two at least know each other. but that would give you a first-year manager and a second-year bench coach. Now, obviously, Albernaz has a lot more experience because he has way more years on a major league coaching staff than Chirinos does, but that's a lot of inexperience. So something I did talk about on Monday's episode is that the Orioles could maybe hire that quote-unquote associate manager role. That's what Albernaz was for his final season in Cleveland this year, where you bring in a more experienced manager or bench coach type to be associate manager for Albernaz, and then you keep Robinson Chirinos with the bench coach title. Maybe the associate manager has more of the bench coach responsibilities than Chirinos has, but it allows you to keep Chirinos on staff if you really think he's one of the big up-and-coming coaches in Major League Baseball, which the Orioles clearly think he is, and still allows you to keep him on staff and have that input for the Orioles and kind of see what he can grow into. I mean, and if you think that sounds crazy, the Blue Jays, again, are in the World Series right now. They have a manager, John Schneider. They have an associate manager, DeMarlo Hale, and they have a bench coach in Don Mattingly. And guess what? It's working out pretty well for that team right now. And as I talked about last week, the O's can learn a lot from the 2025 Blue Jays. Maybe that's something else that they can learn from them as well. Kind of younger manager in Schneider, veteran coach type guy in Hale, and then very veteran manager and coach in bench coach Don Mattingly. It wouldn't be exactly the same, but there'd be a space to bring in a veteran guy in that associate manager role. For third base coach Buck Britton, remember he had been with the Orioles minor league system forever. He was a player, then a coach. He was a AAA manager for a while, was promoted to the big league staff for the first time this year, was just kind of a major league coach to begin the year. But once Hyde was fired, Mansolino was moved from third base coach to interim manager. Buck Britton became the interim third base coach to take over from Mansolino. And I think he stays. Rock Cabaco at Masson did report that Britton has 1 year remaining on his contract as a major league coach, so he'd still be under contract for 2026. The O's have a lot invested in him as a coach. I could see Elias kind of holding firm with Albernaz and be like, hey, we're going to keep Buck Britton around. The guys really like him. The other coaches really like him. He seems to be a huge plus in this organization. So I think he would stick around unless, of course, another team comes calling for a bigger job than third base coach. And then there's a couple of guys where it's like, I think I know the least about, right? The first one is Grant Anders, who's a big league development coach. He's been in the system for a while, both a minor and a major league coach. Most likely he either leaves or maybe is reassigned to a different job in the minor leagues with the system because the Orioles do like him, but it allows you to open a job for Albernaz to bring in somebody on his staff. And I'm just not as versed on what Grant Anders does, so that could just be a blind spot for me. So we'll kind of see on that one. And then the last one is John Mabry, who the Orioles hired as a senior advisor and a major league coach to kind of help Mansolino out after Brandon Hyde was fired. He kind of took the open spot left on the staff when Tim Cousins was fired then as well. Mabry worked with the hitters, but was generally more of a veteran coach who was in the dugout. Again, I would lean towards him not being back. Andy Kuska reported that it is possible that he is back as well, despite being kind of a late addition. He was someone who's maybe coming here to kind of douse the flames a little bit and just an easier guy to let go and have an opening, another one for Albernaz to fill on his staff. We'll probably know more about all of this by next week. Again, next Tuesday, November 4th is set for the introductory press conference with David Rubenstein and Mike Elias and Craig Albernaz to officially announce him as the new Orioles manager. There may be some things that break between now and then, or maybe Elias will make more announcements on guys specifically. He probably wouldn't make announcements on like, we've hired this guy to be a new assistant hitting coach, but he might give definitive, like, yes, Buck Britton is staying, or yes, Drew French is staying announcements next week. So we might know more by then. And Andy Kuska and others, I'm sure, will have more reports on how this coaching staff is going to shake out, and we'll have it all covered here on the show as well. But there's one final coaching thing I wanted to get to. And we did learn about one more specific managerial interview that the Orioles made before hiring Craig Albernaz. And we got confirmation that they interviewed an old friend. We'll talk about that to finish off the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks. You and I make decisions every day, but on Prize Picks, being right can get you paid. So don't miss any of the excitement of this sports season. Whether you're following the NFL, the NBA, or both, there's no better time to jump in on the action. If you haven't tried it yet, Prize Picks is the simplest way to play. Just pick more or less on at least 2 player stats, and if you get them right, you win. It takes less than 60 seconds to make your lineup, and you can play anywhere Prize Picks operates, including California, Texas, and Georgia. And, Prize Picks is easy. You can make a lineup just so quickly. And plus, if one of your players leaves early with an injury, the injury reboot saves your lineup from a loss. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONMLB for $50 in lineups after your first $5 lineup. And that's at Prize Picks. It's good to be right. So one final piece of news that we got this week, this also coming from Rakabako over at Masson, is that the Orioles did officially interview Ryan Flaherty during the managerial process. We had heard from John Heyman that Flaherty was at least going to be in the mix, and we did hear that the Orioles did interview Luis Rojas. We heard they interviewed Albert Pujols, and I believe we also heard they interviewed former Mariners manager Scott Servais. We never really officially heard Craig Albernaz's name come up. And then, of course, as the Orioles do like to operate in secrecy, he ends up being the hire earlier this week. But there might be a couple more names that kind of trickle out as well that did interview with the Orioles. I'm sure it was a wide range of interviews by Mike Elias and the front office. But we do know they interviewed Flaherty. And that, it just kind of makes me happy, right? Former Orioles utility kind of cult hero player for the Orioles, who had been a bench coach for the Padres for a couple of years and the bench coach for the Cubs for the past couple of years. And it's a real rising managerial candidate. Seems he's still in the mix for the Padres job and some of the other 5 jobs that are still out there in terms of managerial openings. And even if he doesn't get one this offseason, it seems pretty likely between this and next offseason, Ryan Flaherty is going to become somebody's manager at the big league level, which is just both wild and kind of awesome that is a reality. We sit in with Ryan Flaherty, who was one of my favorite players on those Buck Showalter era Orioles teams. Kind of a similar coaching path to Craig Albernaz, different in that Flaherty had a semi-long big league career and Albernaz, stalled out in AAA, never made it to the majors, but, bounced around different coaching roles, bench coaching roles under really good managers and seemed to kind of groom him to be ready for the big chair. Now, we'll probably never know exactly why the Orioles chose Albernaz over Flaherty or even over, guys like Pujols and Servais and Luis Rojas, who they interviewed as well. But it's nice to know that he was in the mix. It obviously would have been very, very cool to have Ryan Flaherty be the manager in Baltimore. That would have been awesome. Probably would have been even more exciting than Craig Albernaz, if we're being honest, but it's really hard to tell whether he would have been a better managerial fit. There's not a lot of stats around managers. I also doubt if managers have a gigantic influence on how a team does. I did get a comment, I believe, from Monday's video on the Albernaz News talking about, Connor, how can you say that you don't believe managers have a gigantic impact on the team while also listing through all of Albernaz's accomplishments, all the work he did with catchers and how much better catchers got? I do want to draw the line there a little bit. I do think coaches, hitting coaches, pitching coaches, catching coaches, things like that, have a bigger influence on day-to-day success of the players than the actual manager does. So Albernaz himself can have a bigger impact when he was in those catching coach or bench coach roles that he was with the Giants and Cleveland, and even in the minor leagues when he was a coach with the Rays as well. I think once you get to that manager chair, how I see that role is, yeah, you're, laying out lineups and making pitching changes and pinch hitting, but you're just as importantly kind of managing people. You are managing personalities. You're keeping that clubhouse together. It is a grind to get through a 162-game season, then hopefully plus once you get to the postseason. It's a lot of managing personalities and people, not just players, but other coaches, support staff, everybody kind of in and around that clubhouse, talking to the media. It's a lot of responsibilities there where you don't get as much on-field skills time with the players as you had when, these guys like Hyde, who came up as position coaches and then made it to the manager chair like Albernaz did as well. Your role kind of changes. You can still have some input there. And I think Albernaz will have some input with Rutschman and Basayo and the Orioles catchers because that is his specialty, but it won't be as much day-to-day skill input as he would have as a coach. So I think he does have that effect and he can help out with other coaches trickling down that information, but your impact is less seen, I think, as a manager as it is as a position coach. We just don't see all the work that is done behind closed doors in the clubhouse. And that's why it's a lot harder to evaluate managers, I think, because all you see them do is make a pitching change or make a pinch hitting, and they're relying on data and feel, and there's such minute decisions. It's really, really tough. So that's why I kind of have that view and can kind of separate those two things between the impact and as a coach and the impact as a manager. Still an important role. There's a reason why the managers get paid more than any of the other coaches on staff, but it's because of a lot of that behind the scenes stuff that we can't really see. And hopefully Albernaz has a grip on that in Baltimore, and hopefully Ryan Flaherty does as well, wherever he ends up as a manager. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Unless some other big news breaks, probably not going to have a Friday episode this week. So we'll take a little break here and be back on Monday. But when we get back on Monday, World Series officially going to be over. Whether it goes 6 games and ends Friday or 7 games and ends Saturday, it will be done on Monday. And we know that next week, essentially either Tuesday or Wednesday, free agency is going to officially open. It always does 5 days after the World Series ends. So at some point next week, we will continue doing our season, player review series, but also starting to preview free agency a little bit, because the O's are going to have some option decisions to be made, some qualifying offer maybe decisions, and then really jumping into who those free agents are that are out there. And that begins on Monday. Until then, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Wherever you listen to the show, give us a follow, give us a subscribe, give us a 5-star rating and a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you have any thoughts on the show, you want to talk some Orioles, you want to ask a question or a mailbag question, you can always email me, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. Again, most likely that'll do it for the week. We are back on Monday. It'll be the month of November, and it'll almost be the off season officially. Until then, enjoy the World Series. And I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.